Biden has just dropped this hugely controversial tweet. Muslim culture has been woven throughout American culture from the start, and the internet is furious. Calvin Robinson wrote, "From the very start of what?" Columbu Mishima composed, "This is blatant rewriting of history." And Dewana complained, "As a Muslim, I'm pretty sure that Muslim culture has not been woven throughout American culture from the start." But is this outrage warranted? Because I think we need to be reminded of where the slaves came from: West Africa. And what was the religion of the ruling classes over there? It was Islam. So I propose a new question. How many of the slaves in North America were Muslim? It gets complicated very fast because Islam was a colonizer religion and it wasn't practiced by all, but we can understand that slaves tend to come from the losing side of a local power struggle. So by studying who was in power over a slave supply zone at any one time, we can make some tentative conclusions. For example, the Upper Niger, home of the famous Mali and later the Songhai. They were both Muslim-ruled empires. However, from the decline of the centralized Songhai rule, the non-Muslims like the Bambara tribe under the Coulibaly elite fought in the area and sold many of the conquered into slavery, who would include many Muslims. So from the 15th to the 19th century, many slaves from this area, we can safely say, were Muslim. However, in the 1760s, there was an Islamic revolution of the Futa Toro as a result of opposition of being sold into slavery, and thus from around this time, the supply of slaves moved increasingly inland away from Islamic centers. Despite that, it's estimated that 13.3% of the slaves from this area were Muslim. Further south was Sierra Leone. These slaves were first sold to the Spanish, and then the French, and then the British took over in the second half of the 18th century. This was a much less Islamic area, and it's estimated that 5.5% of these slaves were Muslim. Now, these numbers are very rough, but since about 500,000 African slaves arrived on North American shores, it's safe to say this included a few thousands to maybe 10,000 Muslims. Now the question turns to, were they allowed to stay Muslim? Given that they were a small minority and slaves, it seems unlikely, but there are recorded instances of Muslim slaves performing salat or prayers individually. Ayuba Salaman, who arrived in the 1730s, was recorded to have had his prayer interrupted by a white American child who threw dirt on his face and then chased him away. When he was returned to his master, Ayuba was given a private place to pray. Adding to the notion that many continued to practice Islam, there was a stereotype of Muslims being seen as more intelligent, reasonable, physically attractive, and dignified than other slaves by their owners. They tended to come from the more northerly parts of West Africa and were seen to be more civilized, more informed on farming practices than non-Muslims from Sierra Leone. Muslims were the drivers, the overseers, the confidential servants. Some say this came naturally because they were the slave-owning class back in Africa, and because they tended to be the higher-ranking slaves, there were many recorded tensions between the Muslims and the non-Muslim slaves, to the point where many Muslim slaves were forced by other slaves to give up their faith. However, there's also some reports of some Muslims being so affected by the racist views of white Americans towards the Africans that they used their cultural differences to distance themselves from non-Muslim Africans. Abd al-Rahman, for instance, claimed to be a Moor and said non-Muslim Africans were a race far below him. The influence of Islam would fade away and get assimilated over time, leaving scant traces, but I think it's clear that Islam has its place in African American history, particularly in the social divisions, class structures, and tensions between the slaves during the early years. So is Biden right to say that Muslim culture has been woven through American culture from the start? You tell me in the comments below, and thanks for watching.